is like the the hump hour funnies, right? So we've got a day and a half left. So, but our panelists look very serious. So I'm not going to stop right now. Actually, Tom, Mike, Erika. Erika wouldn't even make eye contact with me during the Harry Potter joke. So I'm worried about this group right now. Okay, we are very happy to continue our discussion regarding EVs. With us today, with us for this panel, we have Tom Ashley, Vice President for Policy, Greenlots. Tom, welcome. Mike Waters, Director Utility Solutions for ChargePoint. Welcome, Mike. Erika Myers, Director Research, Smart Electric Power Alliance. Welcome. Joe Halso, an Associate Attorney with the Sierra Club. Welcome, Joe. And Dave Kolata, the Executive Director of the Citizens Utility Board in Illinois. Welcome, Dave. Happy to have you. Okay, so we will begin our presentations with Tom.
Okay, so I'm going to make a couple promises. I'm going to be less funny than some of the previous panelists.
That's okay.
Might be some
That's
sneaky
okay.
funny, but
I think I've already scoped this group. I've already scoped this group, like I said. Kolata's the only funny guy on this panel. I'm just saying already.
and I also pledge to throw less information at you than some of the previous panelists. That was pretty hot and heavy this morning, but obviously it speaks to the level of depth that there is, number of issues involved. So thank you. As mentioned, I'm Tom Ashley, VP of Policy for Greenlots. I will give you just a quick backgrounder on Greenlots. So the couple of points that I just want to hit here. So we're going to talk just a little bit about interoperability, which I know is something that this commission is quite intent on. I'm going to give a little bit of a market overview and then just talk about some highlights from some other geographies that have been engaged in this space. And I want to just go back for a moment. So the title of this, Driving the Electric Vehicle Market, you know, maybe someone could think that's funny.
I
maybe
was going to give you kudos, but you did it for yourself. That's very good. Yeah.
But the point that I want to make here is that I'm going to be talking through an infrastructure lens, and it is, as we heard earlier, it is infrastructure that at least my firm thinks is going to be driving this market ahead in the near term. Okay, so if you don't know too much about Greenlots, what we do is we make a software platform that manages electric vehicle charging. We also deploy that platform in concert with hardware partners that we can resell hardware, level 2, DC. We can also go out and do a full turnkey, you know, permitting, electrical, construction, maintenance, what have you. This bottom section, so Greenlots has been doing load management and demand response in the EV space for a while. And we've been sort of waiting for the market to develop a little bit more as it regards DER integration, ancillary services, et cetera. So frame of reference. So I'm going to start with a bit of a chat about interoperability. So I thought there was a good treatment of interoperability in phase 2, if I recall. So rough picture here. I don't love the analogy, but I think it's helpful. So think Apples and Androids, think PCs, Macs, etc. So right now, what's going on in the market is the type of communication deployment. So interoperability, we acknowledge it's got a lot of different pieces. We can be talking about driver side, we can be talking up to the grid, we can be talking, you know, payment cards, all kinds of different things. What I'm going to focus on here is just communications between hardware and software, and therefore upstream a little bit more. So the scenario is you can choose kind of an Apple approach, and you have an operating system and a device that is one and the same. Those stay together. Or you can choose more of an Android PC approach where you can mix and match hardware, software, etc. Now I will acknowledge that as Greenlots is a software platform provider, we prefer the Android approach because that allows us to bring a lot of different hardware options to the market. Just this next slide. So what we think for the market is really that this interoperability creates sort of the best competitive environment. It's an opportunity for procurers, buyers, which we'll learn about in a couple slides, to choose from competitive options both on hardware and software up front and then on a rolling basis. So at any point in time, can switch software platforms, integrate new hardware, etc. And while I recognize we're a bit biased in this, our feeling is that this creates the greatest platform for competition between new market entrants, existing market participants, and next slide, we'll call them, new types of products and services. So in phase 2, we talked a little bit about sort of interoperability in the context of a platform, and then to be able to build apps that are based on that platform, et cetera. So we don't know all of what's upcoming in terms of the types of market participants, the types of services. But our feeling is that to seed the market in the right way, we want to create an opportunity for competition amongst all of these various market participants, services, et cetera. Okay, so this is a slide that I stole from Portland General Electric's presentation that they gave in a stakeholder workshop in 2016, and they had consulted with or contracted with Navigant to do some consulting work for them in advance of putting together a filing in Oregon. The picture here is just a snapshot. This is just examples. So we have automakers, we have service providers, we have equipment manufacturers, and we have a lot of overlap. And we're going to be seeing more and more lines being blurred going forward, whether that is automakers providing energy services, energy providers providing mobility services, what have you. And so it's a very complicated system, a lot of overlap, and I would argue that there's significant competition amongst all of these various providers, especially when, let's say, a traditional power player in, say, the IT space, let's say an IBM, SAP, if they decide to come into this space, all of a sudden the more incumbent players, Mike's firm, my firm, all of a sudden it's going to be a very starkly different playing field. So we just saw that there's lots of players and there's more coming into the market. The U.S. market every day, either self-grown, some from, let's say, the West Coast, and some from Europe and other parts of the world. So this top line, these are some of the sellers in this EV charging ecosystem when we're talking about infrastructure. The bottom line are some of the buyers, certainly not all of them. This is meant to be pretty simple. And, as I mentioned about my firm, there's a lot of overlap. There are a lot of companies that do a lot of different things here, and some of them are the same things. The fact of the matter is right now, when there are motivated buyers, there are more than enough motivated sellers. So there's a lot of competition when there's motivated capital That's amongst hardware, software, site development services, you name it. But where there are not enough motivated buyers or motivated capital, there's not a very competitive environment. The bottom line here, so these are some of the types of organizations or categories of buyers for charging services. And in so much they then may turn around and be providers of charging services. The red line right in the middle, that's what I want to highlight. We heard it a little bit earlier, and I think it's maybe easiest to think about in the context of DC fast charging. In the US right now, we have, I'll say, 2 relatively large organizations that have committed to being sellers of charging services to drivers. I'll just name, it's EVgo, it's Electrify America. So they have stood up a model, or are in the process of standing up a model, which is that they are asset owners, they're investing in charging infrastructure, they're owning and operating charging infrastructure, they're selling a charging service to drivers. I will note that those are both relatively unique cases because significant portions of those investments are either directly or are part of settlement processes. Again, some in California, some in DC. Outside of those, we'll call them private, but maybe with an asterisk, investors, we're just not seeing motivated capital coming into the infrastructure space. We're excited, I think all of us in the industry, to see automakers develop more EVs and get more interested in the need to deploy infrastructure. And I think we're all very excited about utilities getting into the space to change the economics about deploying infrastructure. The other 2 buckets down below, so what we are seeing some of, maybe a little bit more on the coasts, are site hosts, retails, MUDs, et cetera, multi-unit dwellings, who are starting to deploy charging infrastructure as amenities. So it's either for residents or for employees. And then we're also starting to see, again, especially in California, and I will reference California again, so you can do with that what you will. But we're starting to see some site hosts, station owners who are really getting into it because they have to. It's required through building codes. It's required in some other form or fashion. So the drivers. The drivers are the takers right now. They are beholden to whatever charging infrastructure there is or isn't out there, and whether or not it works or not. And it's great that there are all of these market participants, buyers, sellers, or somewhere in between. But this stakeholder group that they're serving is getting the short end of the stick right now. And we heard a lot about that earlier. We as an industry have to find ways to create an ecosystem where drivers can potentially be choosers, not just takers. I'm going to pop through a couple geographical examples. Sorry, there are some that include California. And I've also decided to bring in a little rivalry with Michigan, and we'll see how that goes. Okay, so, yeah, well.
You have some friends.
Okay. Well, I have no allegiance to any particular geography. I'm equal opportunity. But let me just run through a couple quick hits on California. So I think we all know that California has more enabling policies than just about anywhere in the U.S. but it's taken a while for that to translate into actual infrastructure deployment. We started with a scenario where the utilities were in fact forbidden from playing in this space. Then there was a recognition that there was something approaching market failure in the private space, and then utilities were encouraged to come back in. And then state legislation passed, and all of a sudden utilities were required. The focus of deployed programs thus far has been light duty, it's passenger vehicles, but we're awaiting decision-making that should occur in Q2, which is likely to support a pretty significant volume of heavy-duty electrification. And we've gone from sort of a pilot phase to a project phase, and we're just about to enter in California a program phase. And I would emphasize that, as we heard earlier, absolutely recognize the need to generate data and learnings and best practices. But we also need to be thinking about how we accelerate or transition from a pilot to a program or from a project to a program, and ultimately are able to get to scale. Bunch of ownership models in California. They really all look about the same in terms of the delivery mechanism to site hosts, which is vendors or service providers work with utilities to go out and bring sites into the programs. So Washington, we had former Commissioner Jones with us this morning. So Washington has enabling legislation, and in fact the legislature worked in concert with the Commission to get there. There's an incentive rate of return for utilities for investing in certain types of charging infrastructure, so over and above standard. The Commission there came out with a policy statement, which I'm sure we've all seen. And a couple of the components of that policy statement that I would highlight are recognition of the need or desire for a portfolio approach. So not just DC fast charging, not just a residential something or other, but really bring in a lot of different components of deployment. There was also a recognition of interoperability. Focus there was mainly on the driver side, but this is something that commissions are going to have to be wrestling with going forward. And the policy statement also outlined the potential for a spectrum of utility roles and ownership models. Quick hit on Oregon, same theme from the West Coast, enabling legislation. Like California, utilities were not just encouraged, but required to make filings. What's been different than California is there's been a fairly robust stakeholder process that the larger investor-owned utilities facilitated in advance of filing. And the focus of those filings, it's really been creating a DC fast charging backbone in and around Portland, as well as bringing in more opportunities for reaching out to potential drivers. And notably, Portland General Electric is working with its transit agency to support charging infrastructure for a handful of buses. And I think we're going to be seeing more requests for this, but PacifiCorp received approval to run a competitive grant program, which was really designed to create an opportunity for innovation and a lot of different non-residential approaches to charging infrastructure. So we'll call this the Mountain or Desert West. So Nevada is a bit of a surprise to me personally. So a little bit of enabling legislation last year created basically a rebate program for NV Energy to deploy. But what's happened since then is Nevada's governor signed on to the Rev West DC Fast Charging Corridor Development Plan. And as a result, the commission took forward that executive commitment and is in the process of rulemaking right now. The recognition has been that given the nature of the economics of DC fast charging and the physical dynamics of corridor development in Nevada, that utilities, and in particular NV Energy, has a significant role to play as an owner and operator of DC fast charging. Quick hit on the Mid-Atlantic. So this is in process right now. Not a whole lot of enabling policy beyond Maryland being a ZEV state, which is pretty significant. But Maryland convened very robust, the most robust that I've seen thus far, that a commission has facilitated in the context of EV charging, stakeholder process that took over a year to complete, and the culmination of that was a filing made jointly by utilities and a significant cross-section of participants in that stakeholder process. This is truly a portfolio approach. There are all sorts of different programs, rate elements, rebates, utility ownership, DC fast charging, residential. And we're seeing sort of that portfolio approach happen more and more in the Mid-Atlantic, especially with the Exelon operating companies. Okay, so here's the last one. Appreciate your good spirit here. So Michigan does not have enabling policy. There's no enabling legislation. Michigan's really decided to get into this for economic and industry reasons, to support its automotive industry and to support the advancement of its automotive industry to the next technology, which is it's electric and concurrently it's autonomous. There's been a pretty strong leadership commitment by the commission there, but this followed a false start by Consumers Energy, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And so what's happened, as we heard this morning, there's been a stakeholder process going now for almost 9 months, and that's culminating in both utilities, including in their upcoming rate filings, EV programs. Okay, so that's me. Hopefully that seemed like a little less content than this morning, but it may have fallen short of my commitment there. Thank you for your time.
Tom, thank you very much. Mike?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chairman Hawk, and the rest of the members here for the opportunity to speak today. Obviously in this phase, what we're looking at is the rulemaking, right, rate making and regulatory concepts around electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging, as well as the utility role. So as a member of one of the larger providers of EV charging solutions, what I thought might be beneficial today is to give you a little bit of an idea around a day in the life, really, of what EV charging means. What's the market look like today? How has it evolved? And what are some of the experiences that we've learned from working with utilities and their programs across the country to date? So, think of it as, taking it down a level from the abstract, but let's dig down a little bit deeper today in this quick presentation. So first, who's ChargePoint? We are in the EV network, or the EV charging industry. We provide both hardware and the network services, as Tom alluded to earlier, right? There's kind of two parts to this solution in this industry. We provide both of those. We are currently the largest one in North America with about 46,000 ports out there. With some exceptions, though, these ports are actually owned and operated by independent business owners and entities, right? So they're the ones who put these stations in. They help manage the stations, they interact with the drivers, they set pricing, so we help support them. So we provide them not only the equipment, but also the networking services to enable them to offer charging as a service. So overall, our mission is all about getting people in EVs, but also giving them the charging solutions they need everywhere along their journey, right? Wherever they go, whether it be at home or anywhere outside the home. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think others have touched on this in terms of the actual EV market itself. What I would say, though, is that in just the last couple of years, we've really seen an uptick here in EV adoption. It's really beginning to take off, and that's in thanks to the fact that we've got new vehicles out there, we've got new models, new selection, longer battery range, lower prices, and so all of this is coming together to really help drive new EV adoption. But what I want to also do is take it down a level, right? Again, instead of the numbers, who are these people and why are they doing this? So why are they going electric? And there's a lot of different reasons. If I had to simplify, I just highlight 4 of them here, but some people do it for cost savings. Some people do it because they like the concept of a cleaner environment. Some do it because they love new technology. Some do it because they love the drive. If you've never driven in one of these vehicles before, I encourage you to do so. You'll really love the acceleration, the quiet, aspects of it, and some of the new technology that's in these vehicles. So again, a lot of different reasons, but this is really what's helping to drive EV adoption here in the last couple of years. Now, the drivers themselves, though, again, that's really at the heart of our company, right? We want to make sure that we understand what those drivers need to help charge their vehicles and make it as convenient and accessible as possible. Quick snapshot on the EV charging industry. So we've talked about the EVs. What about the EV charging industry? It's really hard to sometimes get total numbers on this. There are some, crowdsourcing websites out there. What I pulled was data from Navigant, which attempted to use multiple sources. And Navigant last year indicated that there were about 500,000 charging stations that are basically have been sold to date, and with about 150,000 just last year alone. So that's pretty sizable. The market was around $400 million in terms of that industry, and they estimate that growing to I believe around $2 billion in 10 years, with about 9 million installed base. So pretty sizable. Now, it's still nascent, and there's a lot of change, a lot of innovation going on, but it's still a very active and competitive market today. And just to highlight again, the hardware being one element, but on the network services side, I think the best analogy there is to think about it almost from like an Airbnb or a Lyft, even the Amazon marketplace. It's that online, that cloud solution, the technology platform that is really the consumer interface, right? As well as the owner and the operator of the station. They're able to interface this solution to be able to access the station, be able to set pricing, run reports, et cetera. So it's really important to understand that with connected charging solutions, there's a lot more value inherent than just a plug that may be out there for people to plug into, or an outlet. Let me talk a little bit about a day in the life of an EV driver. So let's say I'm Carl commuter. I wake up, I get in my car, it's fully charged, I head to work, and I use maybe half of my electric miles on the way to work. So I want to make sure if I have a plug-in hybrid that I go back home on all electric. If I had a pure electric car, I want to make sure I've got the range I need to get home and maybe do an errand or two, right? So hopefully I've got charging stations at work. I go there, I go to a station, plug in, I'll tap my card or tap my phone, I'm authorized as an employee, and then I can start charging, right? So I go into work. Maybe around lunchtime I get a notification that my car is done and that someone else would like to use that station. So I go out, I move my car, go out to eat, what have you, and let someone else use that station. So the alternative might be, what if my employer did not have a charging station? So now I'm ready to go home, and I'm a little bit worried. I can't go do the errand I want to do. So I pull up my app. I'm able to, I want to go to the mall. I'll look for a charging station using the app, find it. I can see what the price might be, see if it's available. And if so, I'll go to that station, right? Plug in again, as I talked about earlier, authorize my session. Go in for an hour, and I come out, and I've got 24 more miles of electricity to go home on from that 1 hour. So I'm just kind of topping off while I'm there. And then again, this networking service that I talked about earlier is able to help me finish that transaction, right? So there might be a fee that site host charged, and we're able to help true that up. So I go home. It was a hectic day. I get out of the car, and I just forgot to plug in. But I'm reminded, thanks to the mobile app and this connected solution, that I need to go plug in. I go do that. But it may not start charging until 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at midnight, because I programmed the station to align with the TOU rate, let's say, so I can really optimize off-peak charging. And now I go to bed knowing that when I wake up, my car is fully charged, and I start my next day again. So that's kind of just your day in the life, but also it helps illustrate two things. One is vast majority of charging is done at home. I think you've heard some numbers, 80% maybe. The other 20% will be at either work or around town. And then occasionally, of course, corridor charging, DC fast charging if I need to go somewhere further away. The other thing I would point out from what I reviewed on the slide is just the fact that drivers today, much like their devices in their home, they like a connected experience, right? They want to have control, they want to have transparency, and so much like you see people going towards Nest or a smart security system, right, or the Amazon Echo, what have you, people like that, and so they're expecting that from their EV charging as well. So as I mentioned in the story of Carl the commuter, he charged at a couple of different places even outside of home, right? So who are these entities? Why are they putting in stations? This is different than the gas station model. So we're moving away from all of the charging being done once a week at a gas station type of location, and now more towards people are charging when they park. With, again, some exceptions. If you're on the highway going somewhere, you still are going to use the DC fast charger. But if I'm at work, if I'm around town visiting these different places, I'm going to go ahead and top off while I'm there. So it's a little bit different paradigm. And what we see there are a lot of different entities putting these in, right, for a lot of different reasons. You heard this morning about business case. What I would say there is that if you are taking a very narrow approach and looking at it as what's the financial case, direct financial revenues, I would agree that these are not profit centers. But I would also say that people aren't putting them in as such, right? They have a big enough viewpoint to understand that it's not just about the revenue from these stations. They see other benefits. It could be indirect revenue because it's a retailer. They want people, new people in their store for longer, right, shopping. It might be an employer who sees it as fringe benefits. They want to attract and retain talent, so they're going to offer this as a fringe benefit. It might be a city trying to meet their sustainability goals. So there's many different reasons that people put in the stations. Yes, they often use the ability to charge to recover some revenue, but there's other value propositions there that I just want to highlight. And that's why we've been able to provide tens of thousands of stations out there to date in providing that value. The other key lesson I would point out that we learned early on is that site hosts are really the best ones in a position to manage the charging and manage the driver experience. So there's so many different ones, as I mentioned. Like one size fits all doesn't really work well. If you're a retailer, it's a very different model than if you're an employer or if you're a city. So giving them the tools they need to be able to manage that experience, we found to be really critical. And that's why we've invested so much in that technology platform. And that's what you see on the bottom there, their ability to log into a portal and be able to run reports, to be able to set pricing or access control, do remote diagnostics. All of these features have helped them to be able to realize their value proposition in this effort. So let's transition to utilities, because we are at the commission. My own position, I've even worked for utility for 8 years, specifically trying to help advance electrification of the transportation sector. So I believe then, I believe now, that this is vitally important for utilities to be engaged. This is a great opportunity. If you ask the question too around, is it good for all ratepayers? And I believe it was mentioned this morning around perhaps the rim test, and I happen to have an example here, but there are others around this kind of calculation that basically the revenues from electric vehicles will outweigh the cost to serve that vehicle. And there's been many, many studies. This is Seattle City Light. Obviously, there are some nuances here. The more that we can move this to be off-peak, the better that value is, that net benefit is. But the gist is, all utility customers are really benefited by more electric vehicles on the system. And so there's that net benefit there, the MPV that you see there, but basically there's also a little bit of headroom that utilities could utilize in helping to advance this market. Now, there's 3 different phases that I would say that kind of utilities go through, at least along their journey of supporting this. And I've simplified it, but the easiest way is the first is just understanding the data and the charging, right? So it's all about where are these cars, how are they charging, and how is that going to change over the next 10 years? Very important when we think about planning for infrastructure. The second level, I would say, is more around load management. So now that I understand it, how do I help shape that? How do I help influence that? And we see that through smart charging programs at home. That's the lowest hanging fruit. Again, vehicles charging there 80% of the time. And it's very easy to give, if you give people the right incentive, they'll happily charge off peak. So you can help mitigate that, any distribution issues from that standpoint. And the third gets into a more advanced phase, which is around, okay, the infrastructure itself. Is there an ability to help advance the deployment of that infrastructure? And we're seeing more and more utilities now at this stage. So let's speak about that a little bit. How can that play out? We have, again, a lot of experience in working with these, and this is simplified, but you saw a version of this actually earlier today. But this just attempts to outline a couple of different models where we've seen investment and incentives in charging infrastructure by utilities. The first thing to do, though, is really look at what are the 3 pieces of the puzzle, right? You have the utility distribution system up into the meter. You have the electrical infrastructure on the customer side of the meter up into the charging station, and then the station itself along with the network services. So that's 1, 2, and 3, just to kind of keep it simple. Business as usual, obviously, is up until the meter. That's the utilities purview, and then after that, a site host may go buy a station and put it in, and 2 separate things going on, right? They don't necessarily talk to each other. On the other models, this is where we have deeper utility engagement. And so, for example, the first one is the make ready. This is where the utility, in essence, is almost an extension of the distribution system, right? They help install and cover the cost for the electrical infrastructure on the customer side of the meter up into the charging station, and allow them to choose from a qualified list of stations that would still provide benefits to the utility and to all customers, because it will provide data and potentially load management capability. So that's a model we've seen from SCE in California. We've seen this from Eversource that was approved in Massachusetts. The next one would be extending that idea all the way through the charging station, right? Turnkey solution, utility owns even the charging station itself. In this case, it's a little bit more complex, obviously. There's more questions there around the details of the program. How can the site host still be able to be engaged and be able to choose the actual charging or the actual solution on their property? But this is a model we've seen as well. SDG&E, PG&E are two really big examples where they have developed a program where they actually have elements where they will own and maintain that charging infrastructure on the customer's side or on their premise. And the customer still has the ability to choose the right charging solution for them and to be able to manage that driver experience. So those are really good models that I wanted to point out there. One of the challenges here, of course, are easements. You get into easements and questions around, too, the cost effectiveness, right, when you do the entire amount of the deployment. But again, there's participation payments that can help reduce that burden. And going back to rebates or make-readies, that also helps move the cost burden more to the site host and keeps them to have skin in the game. And then touching on the last one, the utility rebate, simple financial transaction, where the utility can help financially offset some of the costs. And in exchange, again, the participants, the site hosts, are actually choosing infrastructure that can provide data and DR capability to the utility. So there's still that link in terms of providing grid benefits. I would point out with all of these programs, there's no one solution here, right? Some people ask, well, what's the right one? Well, they all can work. They all can provide data to the utility in terms of being able to share that data in any of these cases. And all of them can provide demand management capabilities, right? So that's not so much a threshold. It's just the question over what's the regulatory requirements locally. What are the different use cases you're trying to solve for? Workplace, public, multifamily dwellings. And they each may have a different answer, right, in terms of what's the better model. So just to go to my last slide, and I've already touched on a few of these things, but the question here is just, or the intent is to provide some thoughts around the best practices. Obviously, this forum is great here today, and we welcome additional dialogue around this. I think it's a great opportunity for utilities, environmental organizations, EV charging industry, OEMs, automakers, everyone to talk about these issues and help provide each other, our best knowledge. The other thing is, I would say regulatory clarity is very important. If you're a utility, you want to be able to know that you can operate in the space on the customer side of the meter, right? What are those rules of engagement, and how do I recover those dollars? And not just, expenses, but, can it also be incentivized? I think the regulatory asset model in this case is really interesting for rebates to kind of help level that playing field. I would also encourage that education and outreach for electrification in these programs is also very important, and to consider that to be an eligible cost that they can recover. The regulatory clarity not only provides the utility confidence, but also provides the market and the participants confidence, right? So as we talked about earlier, let's not lose fact of that these programs, yes, they need to be able to provide ratepayer benefits, but they also need to work for the drivers. They need to work for the site hosts, right? There's needs that they have. Are drivers going to be able to have charging solutions where they want it, where they need it? Do they have the ability to seamlessly move between their utility territory and other territories, right? Because obviously we're in a mobile society. From a site host standpoint, do I maintain my ability to choose that best solution that'll work on my property for those customers visiting me? Is that a consideration within these programs? And then the industry itself, the charging industry, we need to be able to have insight too into where this is going. So I just encourage this clarity is very important from a regulatory standpoint. A few other things, obviously I've alluded to data collection and demand response. All of this is very important. If this is going to be a utility program, obviously ensuring that this provides grid benefits is going to be critical. And smart home charging programs are a great way to do that. You've heard earlier from folks who've mentioned the DC fast charging rates. Are there tailored commercial rates that could be offered for DC fast charging at those higher power levels to address the initial concerns around demand charges? I would also point out, again, the balancing to try to mitigate those risks that either ratepayers, from the utility standpoint, is just looking at those costs and benefits and making sure that, that those are balanced, right? Whether it's a rebate program or some other program, making sure that it's tailored to address those risks. And then what I would just point out, finally, looking at the examples of these programs, on the bottom, you know, I'd be happy to talk about any one of these, but that's just an example of some of the largest programs that are out there today, both from East Coast to West Coast. I'd say, though, when we talk about programs that have got this right, that have really worked through the details, worked with the private industry, with site hosts, with drivers in mind, you know, all of these ports that are considered here, I would say in these programs, it's either 100% or a vast majority are going to incorporate those elements, right, of maintaining customer choice, maintaining the ability for those site hosts to play an important role for those drivers that are visiting their premises. And just what I would end with is just three things. You know, one, EVs, as we've talked about, are just a great opportunity all the way around, right? They're good for the driver, good for the environment, good for the economy, but also good for the utility, right, if this is done right. Utilities, number two, really have a lot of different opportunities to help advance this technology. We encourage it, as I think everybody here today has encouraged it, right? This is something that needs to happen and needs to, we'd love to see more engagement from utilities. And then third, as we think about these infrastructure programs, you know, the devil's in the details. It's not an abstract discussion. We need to move more towards, you know, how do we leverage everybody's best efforts, right, and capabilities in these activities, both from the utilities, EV charging industry, and other stakeholders in this space. And we welcome that discussion. You know, in this final slide, I put it up there because it's just visually really cool, but the amazing thing here is that this is not even doctored, right? So this is from SpaceX, and they, if you don't know, they sent a Tesla up in their latest rocket launch, right? Why? I really don't know. But it was a cool, right? So there was no good reason other than to really show that it could be done. And I think that's amazing, right? I've been in this space 10 years. Our company's been in this 10 years. I didn't imagine 10 years ago that one of those first vehicles that was kicking this off, the Roadster, would now be orbiting the sun, right? It's just kind of bizarre. I'm sure Elon Musk figured it out 10 years ago. He had this all as a plan. But the point here, though, is that, I mean, there's so much that I'm excited about, you know, in the state of Ohio through this proceeding. I really think the art of the possible here, we're hearing from everybody. We're going to do some great things here with electrification. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Mike, thank you very much. And when we talk about expanding the scope of the PUCO's jurisdiction, space seems like an amazing place to expand to. Erika, you're up.
Thank you all very much, Chairman Hawk and other commissioners. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. What you might not be able to tell from my bio is, yes, I live in Washington, D.C. right now, but I'm actually from Ohio. I was born and raised just outside of Toledo. Most of my family still lives in Northwest Ohio, so I was just there this weekend to celebrate my cousin's wedding in Bowling Green. And interestingly, you can see from my uncle's farm all the original turbines that were done in the early 2000s that really piqued my interest way back then in the idea of renewable energy. I also have connections to the automotive industry as well. My father worked at the Maumee stamping plant for Ford for 20 years, growing from a forklift driver to eventually quality engineer for that company. So very excited to be back and certainly talking about EVs, which is one of my personal passions.
So Erika very intelligently pumps up Ohio while Tom's presenting about the merits of what Michigan's doing. So well done, Erika.
Ohio is the best. And absolutely, I was raised to be a Bucks fan and a Cleveland Indians fan, so I'll add that in there. This is what I'll be talking about today, a little bit of an overview of who SEPA is and what we do. And then you guys get the first view of a report that we're about to publish on Monday that's looking at utility EV programs and activities and utility regulatory activities across the country related to EVs. So this is, you guys get the first sneak peek of what the findings were of that. First, though, our mission, we are a nonprofit 501c3 based out of Washington, D.C. Our primary mission is to help facilitate clean energy through the electric power sector, primarily through education, research, standards, and collaboration. And we do that without advocacy, without lobbying, entirely educational. And we are also membership based. We have over 1,100 members right now, about half of which are electric utilities from across the country. You all actually have access to all of SEPA's resources. We make that available to all the commissioners across the country. So you can access all of our content, including the following, our programs, including webinars. We have working groups on a variety of 15 different topic areas. We also have research papers, most of which are publicly accessible, although we do have a lot of member-only content which you can access. We also do communications on a regular basis through our blog, including Utility Dive, and we have some advisory services as well. These are the reports I'll be referencing today as part of my presentation. The main one, of course, though, is the biggest one, which is our new report called Evolving to Unlock Grid Value. We also have published a report on EVs last year in 2017 called The Case for Managed Charging, which addresses a lot of the topics you've heard today, so I don't want to rehash too many of those. But again, all these reports are available on our website. So why are EVs important to SEPA? We expanded from a solar-only organization about 2 years ago to the Smart Electric Power Alliance, and largely this was because we knew pretty early on that you can't really integrate solar without talking about all the other opportunities with behind-the-meter assets, including energy storage, demand response, and the list goes on of all the different technologies that you can more smartly integrate into the grid and provide grid value. So what you see here is a matrix we came up with about the different DER capabilities that are available behind the meter, and we think about it from the perspective of energy, capacity, and of course ancillary services, including things like voltage regulation, even something as like spinning reserves. So how could these different behind the meter assets potentially provide those values? And so as you can see from this matrix, battery storage is a big one that can service a lot of these different areas. And when you look at EVs specifically, they can provide three main things. Battery storage, if you can optimize the battery to provide vehicle-to-grid services, but also interoperable load and direct load control from a managed charging perspective. And what that enables you to do is to obtain value both for energy and capacity, but mostly a bigger asset is balancing and spinning and non-spinning reserves, which I don't think anyone has mentioned here before, but being able to leverage these like other demand response services would enable these, very inherently flexible load assets to provide those services to this grid. And from a valuation perspective, obviously the most important thing is to modulate these charging activities to reduce peak. So the most expensive electricity over the course of a year is your peak electricity. So the fact that some DERs can be better to serve as peak shed, that in fact is related to their inherent value to the grid. With the flexible nature of EVs in terms of their charging capabilities, they would have potentially even the most value. This is an illustrative example of how you may modulate some of this charge over the course of a 24-hour window. In this case, what we show with the light blue piece of the graph is managed charging or non-managed charging with a time of use rate. So what you see here is low charging over the course of the day, but as folks come home or they set their timers, in this case at 11 o'clock, you see what's known as a timer peak, where potentially lots of vehicles could simultaneously start charging and cause effects, almost like mini peaks on a distribution system. What you would be able to do with managed charging is to smooth out that load, and here in Ohio, potentially match that with the wind spike at night. Like I said before, I'm from Bowling Green, also known as Blowing Green, which is very windy at night. So the other potential benefit from managed charging, we released a report with SMUD and Black and Beach as well last year that looked at the potential cost of the transformer upgrades through 2030. This was a scenario of roughly 250,000 EVs on their system, would cost as much as $50 to $100 million to address with unmanaged charging. They identified managed charging as a way to potentially mitigate or entirely eliminate these additional transformer costs from the 17%, roughly 17% of transformers that would need to be upgraded or replaced. And as we look at some of these forecasts of necessary charger needs, this particular graphic came from EEI last year that forecasts through 2025 were roughly at 450,000 chargers at the end of 2017, according to Navigant. So if we look here, we'll need somewhere between 4.4 million and 5.5 million by 2025 to address the forecasted growth of vehicles in the United States. So these are ports, total number of ports. And Navigant estimated we're at 450,000 ports today, both home, public, and workplace. So we should think about ways with this growth in charging infrastructure to do it right the first time. So SEPA's new report that's going to be released talks about utility evolution when it comes to the development of EV programs around the country. Similar to the walk, jog, run framework that Paul DeMartini and others have published in the past through GridWorks, we see a similar pathway for electric vehicle deployment that requires foresight and planning. So we know that utilities typically follow this trajectory where they begin to experiment with electric vehicles at the earlier stages. This is mostly done through their electric vehicle fleet deployments, workplace charging for their employees, and then simply putting information about their electric vehicle programs or rates on their website. Next is an intermediate phase, which includes more external-facing EV activities and programs with customers. And then finally, the late stage, which is the penultimate stage, would be active engagement with our customers and leveraging these as DER assets for the grid through things like managed charging or vehicle-to-grid. So we did a survey of roughly 500 utilities across the U.S. and identified 14 different utility EV activities and grouped them into these different stages. What we found was that there were only 15 late-stage utilities across the U.S., 112 intermediate, and 359 early stage. And we also paired that with the total number of known customer accounts within each of these utilities, with the bulk of the customers located in the early and intermediate stages. You break this down by type of utility, and what we found was the vast majority of intermediate and late-stage utilities were within the IOUs, with municipals shortly behind and followed by cooperatives. In Ohio specifically, we found of the 8 that were included in our survey, roughly half are early and half are intermediate stage. Breaking this down specifically by the types of activities that were included in the survey, the vast majority of activity, of course, was in the early stage, with EV information on the website being the simplest, but surprisingly only about 1/3 of utilities in our survey have EV information on their website. The other information we found was EVs and utility fleet shortly after that, followed by workplace charging at a utility. In terms of intermediate phase activities, public use charging was the most popular. This is where electric utility was directly involved in the development or deployment of public charging, followed by customer engagement activities. This could include things like ride and drive activities or something more interfacing with customers, followed by special EV rates. In terms of late stage, the majority that we found were managed charging pilots. There were 2 vehicle-to-grid pilots we identified, and finally, no full-scale implementation of vehicle-to-grid or managed charging. I will note that all of these had to be active programs. These did not include retired programs, and they were found between July and October of last year. We similarly did an exercise with regulatory filings. Here we go. Utility activity related to these. The vast majority of the activities we identified were related to website. with 5 of the 8, followed by public use charging with 3. I will note that actually we found 2 programs that had residential EVSE charging incentives, both of which were $39.99 per month charge for access to a level 2 charger. So we used AE Power Suite to identify 72 EV-related dockets between 2010 and 2017, but we only included 57 of those in our analysis because about 15 of those had been merged or suspended over the course of that time. What we found was large growth in the number of dockets related to EV over this 7-year period through December 2017. Some of those have since been finalized that were originally open in this calendar year, such as Southern California Edison's transportation electrification proposal, which was finalized earlier this year. But for the most part, I would say this data is still relevant for our conversation today. So what we did was we again broke these out by the different activities I mentioned earlier. There actually were 3 additional activities that were not included in my original figures, including the commission role in EVs, the utility role in EVs, and allowing third-party resale of electricity. We also included that in this analysis. What you can see from the dark blue was the number of adopted dockets in full or in part. The light blue is the number not adopted, meaning that they were not, they did not get adopted at all, and the number that were still open or pending at the point of the survey. And what we found from this was that the vast majority of activities were in the intermediate stage, very few in the late stage, and very few in the early stage, actually. So of those in the intermediate phase, the most used were EV-specific rates as part of the docket filings, and then public electric vehicle charging infrastructure. There were still a good number of those that were outstanding at the time of the survey. And then we also did a map to represent, or heat map, I should say, to represent where a number of these dockets occurred. Not surprisingly, the most in California, but we also found quite a few here in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana specifically. So as you can see from this information, there's a lot of work to be done. And SEPA is doing quite a bit to help bring all these different stakeholders together to work out solutions that help everyone. We have an EV working group that we kicked off in May 2017. We meet every month. We have subcommittees that we get together to address specific challenges with managed charging, for example, distribution planning for EVs, and utility rates, tariffs, and incentives. We also have a workshop coming up in April where we've invited utilities to address some of these topics. We also have, for example, our Grid Evolution Summit in July. We have an entire track related to electric vehicles that will bring together experts from the field. We also have more information and information that we've published over the course of the last few years at sepapower.org/electric vehicles. So you're welcome to look at afterwards. And I'm happy to address any questions you may have. Here's my contact information.
Erika, thank you very much. We will undoubtedly have questions for all of you post the presentations. Joe, you're up. Thanks.
All right. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Some very thorough presentations. Dave and I are batting cleanup here, I believe, so I'll make a promise not to be duplicative, and also promise to try to limit my California references, which as a good Midwesterner is always my goal. And I will mention only to Commissioner Conway that I went to school up north.
But you just mentioned it to everybody, Joe.
You caught me, Mr. Chairman. So my name is Joe Halso. I'm an attorney at the Sierra Club, where I focus entirely on transportation and almost exclusively on issues at the intersection of electric vehicles and the electric grid. Sierra Club is the nation's oldest and largest environmental organization. Core focus of our work is to limit the impacts of climate change, which, as I'll mention in a moment, includes transportation. My goal here is really to report on approaches and lessons from other states with respect to these issues. And as a general matter, I think approaching the question of the utility and commission role as iterative, but generally involving two parts. One is about convening stakeholders, about identifying and beginning to address those core basic questions. I think that's starting to happen today. And then part two is about continuing that conversation, about defining roles, setting policy expectations, approaching consensus on no regrets, policy initiatives and programs. And then, and only then, you'll get to a place where you have enough information to ask even more hard questions of yourselves. But the good news is these conversations are happening across the country. So my message here is you are not alone. On this map, I've highlighted commission level activity, either stakeholder processes or active proposals from utilities with respect to EVs. I did a little math this morning. In sum, there's about $1.3 billion worth of proposed programs before regulators right now. And if I edited this map slightly, it would reflect the $300 million or so of already approved programs, which are not just in coastal elite states, but in Kentucky and Florida, in Utah. And Sierra Club is engaged in the vast majority of these matters. And so with that in mind, I wanted to be clear about our organizational view in this space. We're strongly supportive of utility action to advance transportation electrification, including recovery for infrastructure investments where they're designed to deliver widespread benefits. And we take this position because of the win of EVs on air quality and environment, on energy security, grid and ratepayer benefits, regional economic benefit. This won't be surprising, but there's two forces in particular that animate our position. One is the promise of climate and air quality benefits, which begs this question: are electric cars green? They are, in fact, plugged into the grid. They're powered by the generation mix that is on board. And as you can see from this handy chart from Union of Concerned Scientists, even in Ohio, on an efficiency equivalent basis, an electric car would be getting 44 miles per gallon compared to conventional gasoline vehicle. And that's in Ohio with some 60% electricity from coal. Same holds true even in Missouri, where there's 80% electricity from coal, and I could show you a similar chart with respect to the air quality benefits as it relates to criteria pollutants. And then EVs are needed to meet our climate goals. You don't have to take it from a tree-hugging attorney like me. The science is unequivocal. And the vast majority of our, not the vast majority, but at least a third of our emissions in the U.S. come from transportation. And in summer 2016, transportation emissions overtook emissions from the electric sector. So there's a real problem. But I know climate doesn't get everybody up in the morning, and even if it does, not all commissioners are statutorily authorized to take climate into account. So the second animating force for my work is the promise of grid benefits. Here's a chart similar to one Mike showed, and I'm sure others you've seen, about translating those grid, societal, and EV driver savings that can result from widespread electrification. This chart is taken out of Michigan. It's meant to be illustrative. It's directionally consistent with some 20 or 25 other cost-benefit studies I've seen, including one for AEP Ohio's territory. Now, at the same time, I'll caution these benefits come with scale. They depend in part on efficient integration into the grid, and they won't occur automatically, which is really where the role for the commission comes in my view. And, if our entire system is electrified, it could raise consumption by 25%. But most studies would show that if done efficiently, it may only raise demand by a couple of percent. And there's a real promise in that in terms of system efficiency, and then also flexibility and reliability, which this chart does not illustrate. So as we've heard from many, utilities with the help of regulators setting the table can unlock these benefits reflected in this chart. But before I get into how to do that, I want to briefly address the reason why action is needed in the near term, especially in Ohio, where we have relatively limited EV penetration, although of course Ohio's in the top half of states in the US, and I think even top 20. There's strong trends driving EV adoption, falling battery costs, shared mobility, new mobility services. There's a real lack of predictability in this market. Mobile assets are more flexible from the view of the grid, but also less predictable. And then there's the diversity of players. Coordination is required across a wide variety of stakeholders. I'd wager many of the folks here today are not those that have a strong or regular practice before this commission. And this chart is just meant to illustrate all of those different stakeholders interested in this space. And for whatever reason does not include environmental organizations, but just imagine us tucked in there. So how do we begin the process of unlocking these benefits, begin addressing key questions and answers? I think first is establishing a clear role for the commission, both a process, whether that's a working group, investigation, and some clear intended outcomes, policy guidance, orders. Some of this can be developed as a process moves along. To me, Power Forward is an important venue to begin the conversation. And then moving to beginning to identify and consider, and in some cases to answer some threshold questions. I've tried to group these into some buckets here. So the first being some market certainty for third-party providers of EV charging services like Greenlots, like ChargePoint. Are they magically transformed into public utilities pursuant to Ohio's utility laws? That's the key question to answer for some regulatory certainty. Can they charge by the kilowatt hour at those stations, whether operated by ChargePoint, which is not ChargePoint's business model, or operated by a third-party provider? What jurisdiction over consumer protections might the commission have? Those are some core questions that would bear addressing. And also sort of jurisdiction and utility-specific planning for an electric future, whether or not the utility is investing in infrastructure. Questions about whether rate structures are sufficient to drive strong integration of EV driver load, or whether they support the electrification of transit, whether EVs are part of the Commission's planning processes looking out into the future. Then the third bucket here is sort of assessing, guiding, and refining the utility role with respect to potential infrastructure investment or other action to drive electrification. That could be the provision of guiding policy principles, not unlike the Washington document mentioned earlier. It could be how to address the public interest in the EV context when looking at a potential utility program. And then continued review of a no-regrets pilot if it's in fact approved. So towards some consensus principles, there's been some work done there. Much work been done among stakeholders to find alignment in stakeholder processes like Maryland, which was mentioned, where there's a package of proposals before the commission proposed not just by the state's 5 utilities, but by a huge group of stakeholders that worked on developing those in concert. There's also been work done among stakeholders that just develop high-level principles. The Transportation Electrification Accord is highlighted here, an effort among a diverse group of stakeholders, including Illinois CUB and the Sierra Club, focusing on medium and heavy-duty electrification in addition to light-duty vehicles, to interoperability, to the importance of grid integration. I have paper copies of that I'd be happy to put into your hands. And then moving towards weighing the public interest when it comes to assessing a potential utility program to invest in infrastructure. Despite some of the nitty-gritty details of this policy space, I submit that weighing the public interest or prudency, what's just and reasonable, in the context of a proposed EV program maps sort of more neatly onto traditional questions asked of utility regulators than it would seem. I think when you're asking about what's used and useful, you're asking, are these stations going to be deployed strategically? That is, in places where EV drivers need them. When you're asking about improving system efficiency, flexibility, and reliability, asking about efficient integration of EV load, whether there's time of use rates, whether we're talking about demand response programs, collecting the data to support them in the future. In terms of defining a market role, talking about supporting the market for third-party providers, some of the pieces Mike got at. And then equitable treatment is a part of what this commission does in setting electricity rates and defining the utilities role. And in the context of electrification, I think that means serving all customers, which means thinking about beyond light-duty vehicles, electrifying transit, and also means thinking about, excuse me, also means thinking about addressing those sources of pollution for burdened communities, oftentimes goods movement, medium and heavy-duty vehicles. This has been touched on, and so I won't linger but where charging stations need to go. That's commonly the home, and next up is the workplace. That's where we ought to put them, and they'll be most used, therefore most flexible, most able to be leveraged for good. I'll note that doesn't always mean they'll be in public places, which is somewhat counterintuitive. I'll also note there's a particular justification for utility investment in multi-unit dwellings, which are demonstrably underserved. This is a chicken and egg slide that I'll skip, but I'll give you a taste of the photograph. Grid integration I mentioned, thinking about increasing that system efficiency, flexibility. Just an illustration, on the left here you have two cities with time of use rates for EV charging. You can see that the charging comes online at midnight, and so we can see that those price signals in fact do affect driver behavior. On the right hand side you see cities without that, and drivers are plugging in when they get home from work, likely exacerbating system peaks. Just here is another slide about grid integration. This is a BMW pilot, demand response pilot. The takeaway here is not sort of the fancy graphics, but that there's this numerous pathways for load management, many of which are still being explored. And so it's important that when we're looking at a utility filing, we're seeing that there's an attempt made to gather some data, potentially pilot some of these concepts for two reasons. One, unlocking the benefits is really the justification for utility investment here, period. And then two, there's a lot of work left to be done in terms of exploring what drivers will and won't tolerate. It's a bit about supporting the competitive market. I think Mike touched on this, and so I'll move along. And then just serving all customers here. I mentioned it's important to think about transportation electrification as more than light-duty vehicles, as addressing pollution sources that burden some communities, as addressing public transit, which improves access to clean transportation for everyone, whether or not they even drive a car. And then also siting chargers equitably, even in the context of a light-duty vehicle program, and potentially pairing that with complementary programs, which is how we've addressed getting charging and getting electric cars into disadvantaged communities in California. This is a diagram representation of some of the program designs that Mike and others mentioned. I won't linger here. I'll only note that I agree with Mike that each of these models can work. A rebate style model, a make-ready model, end-to-end ownership. I'll only note that the data returns suggest that some are better at some things than others. For instance, end-to-end utility ownership, based on the data returns in California, that turnkey approach of utility owning and maintaining end-to-end is better for addressing the multi-unit dwelling need, because managers and owners of multi-unit dwellings are not so interested in procuring contracts, finding vendors, and dealing with ongoing maintenance. And so I will leave it there. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Joe. And Dave, our last speaker, and then we'll head into questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the invite and the chance to speak to you here today. We've written a consumer guide on the EV issue called the ABCs of EVs. I have hard copies available if you'd like to see them. What I'm going to do here today is give just sort of a brief overview of what it says. Now, I'm the 10th of 10 speakers on this issue, and it's essentially impossible not to repeat what others have said going before me. So what I'm going to do is tell a little bit of a story briefly about how we got engaged in this issue from a consumer perspective, and then put an emphasis on some very key principles that have been mentioned before, but I think are particularly key as we think about the consumer and public interest going forward. So we view transportation electrification as increasingly likely. And we start with that premise. And we started by looking at some of the market projections. If you look at Goldman Sachs, they're predicting a 22% market share for electric vehicles by 2025. For Bloomberg New Energy Finance, they're going through 2040, but they're now saying it's going to be 54% of car sales by then, and that's up from 35% last year. And if you look across the projections, that's a recurring theme. And as we looked into it, there's a variety of reasons for it, but two kind of stood out. One, the declining cost curve of batteries, which has been going down quite significantly. And there will be a point very soon when electric vehicles, all in, even from the day one, are absolutely the most cost-effective thing to do from a consumer, from a driving point of view. So that declining cost curve of batteries is a big driver of this. But there's also China. And right now, it's my understanding there's roughly about as many drivers in China as there are Americans. But there's still, depending how much they want to develop, about 600, 700 million people more to go. And they just simply cannot have all those cars on the road being internal combustion engines. Their pollution problems are already very dire. They just simply can't do that. And so if you look at what China is doing very strategically, they're moving into this space. And I think that will reverberate around the world. And so in all likelihood, we are going to see a significant transportation electrification. So starting with that premise, well, what happens to the grid if we have millions of cars on the road, I think, is sort of the key public policy question, millions of electric vehicles. And that, I think, presents opportunities and also challenges. I mean, ultimately, as I'll explain, you can boil it down to we want to make sure people charge at the right times and don't charge when it's not the right time. But that actually was going to require a need for proactive policies. It's something that we're better off getting ahead of rather than responding to. And I do think it puts, I'm not sure if pressure is the right word, but it is in tension with a lot of the ways we've traditionally approached utility regulation and utility issues. So we do think this is a very important issue for commissions and states to be addressed in. What we'd like to see ultimately, and what our guide makes a pitch on, is that we start with customer-focused principles as we engage in this topic. I think looking around the country, I think it's fair to say, in our opinion at least, that too much of the attention has focused on a question like, for example, what should the utility own and what should the utility not own? It's not that those aren't important questions, they are. And in our minds, those are secondary questions. The first question is, how can we make sure, ultimately, at the end of the day, that consumer benefit is maximized and that all consumers, whether you drive an EV or not, are going to be better off than they would be otherwise. So we want to start with that. So what I'm going to do is just go briefly over a few of these principles, several of which have been mentioned before. This one, when you boil it down, is kind of the whole ballgame in some sense. And really what we need to do is make sure that charging patterns are optimized to improve load shape, to prevent peak demand increase to the extent possible. That should certainly be our goal. To facilitate integration of variable energy resources, and ultimately to maximize grid value. Now, there's a couple things about this. First, it'll be different from state to state. A classic example of this might be California, where they have the duck curve and they have a lot of solar during the day. Well, they need to, from a public policy point of view, a grid point of view, balance that out with electric vehicles. Well, that all of a sudden means you care a lot about workplace charging because during the day a lot of people are going to be at work and you don't want them to charge at night when they're at home. In Illinois, where I'm from, we have many hours of the night where there are negative prices. So there, home charging becomes a much better, is essentially what we want. So it's going to vary by state what's best for the grid. It's also going to vary over time, potentially, because as you start moving a load around, you could create another peak. And so the system has to be adaptable. You can't just simply say, well, we absolutely 100% need everyone to charge at night, always, or conversely, during the day. It's going to depend on the grid and market conditions. So you have to build that flexibility in. And I think that's something important to consider. Ultimately, what am I talking about here? I mean, it's a combination of time-based rates, it's demand response, it's load management practices, it's storage, and all being used essentially to make sure that the grid value is maximized. I do see a key utility role here at the end of the day, especially as you play this out. There's not only the wholesale market price question. In theory, you could just simply handle that with real-time pricing, for example. But also, especially given clustering of where we're likely to see EVs start, given just socioeconomic characteristics, there's a grid aspect to this as well. And if you had people charging, even if wholesale prices were low, in a way that required a transformer upgrade, for example. Well, those costs are socialized across the system. You're going to need to have, at some point, kind of a local distribution level price signal as well. And so those are the types of things that we think we need to get going on. We do see an important role for the utility there. It does, as you start playing that thought out, and we go a little bit into this in the guide, it does, I think, open up, well, what's the best way to incent that? What's the best way to compensate the utility at the end of the day for that? Our own view at this point, and I think there are multiple options, is that it does sort of nudge you in the direction of a performance-based approach, where, in effect, if consumer money is going to be spent on EV infrastructure, that let's have the incentive structure aligned so that we know if the utility does its job, that it's going to lead to consumer and societal benefit. Getting back to a point that the chairman made earlier, I also see a key role in making sure that all these resources are aggregated and bid into wholesale markets. And a lot of that may not occur. I mean, a utility, I think, could play probably a key role there. There is economic value from the distributed energy resource aspect of EVs, and I think this was said, or at least intimated earlier. In some ways, like EV infrastructure and EVs are like the perfect distributed energy resource. People don't drive very often; they don't really care as long as it's there when they need it. Depending on who you believe, a lot of it will be automated soon. And if a car is smart enough to get through downtown Columbus without a driver, it certainly can be automated to respond to price signals. So, I mean, it's like the perfect distributed energy resource even before you get into other benefits for carbon and just lowering transportation costs. So there's a lot of potential here, but we have to make sure that everything is optimized. A second set of principles, these were mentioned earlier, that I think are important from a consumer perspective, are around the openness, the seamlessness of the network, the interoperability. From a driver's perspective, you're going to want to be able to essentially, charge your car on any network, on any utility that's within a state, but also between states. I mean, that's a big issue. There are different models on how you do that, but I do see a role for commissions, especially working through NARUC, because this starts to become a regional and a national issue, for NASUCA, the consumer advocate organization, for EEI, because ultimately you're going to want to make sure that you can drive from Columbus to Chicago without having to register for multiple utilities and multiple charging stations within utilities. That's not a really great experience, and I think this is something that states and PUCs can help with, especially if there's going to be any consumer dollars spent. It kind of seems like the thing that should be required, just like maximizing the grid value. Innovation and competition, I think, relates to this for reasons that were mentioned earlier, but this is also a key thing, because I was talking about the important role the utility can play in the grid and price signals and aggregation, but I also think that it can't be only the utility involved in this space. There's a lot of encouraging trends out there. We want to encourage as much innovation and competition as we can. I don't think that this really is a traditional monopoly asset, and so we want to make sure that we have robust innovation and competition in whatever network we end up with. A third set of principles, and these don't all relate, would just be, from a regulatory point of view, things that we think are important beyond the previous two. One is I do think that it's a good issue for collaboration and stakeholder processes. Joe mentioned the Transportation Electrification Accord. We are a signatory of that. I think that there's a fair amount of room, at least on the front end, to work things out, or at least get a framework that we can start having honest discussions. I don't think it's the type of issue where litigated proceedings are necessarily will produce the best outcomes. I do think it's one where we may have more in common than people might expect, and then we can go from there. So I think collaboration is important. I think a cost-benefit analysis on all of this is crucial. To the extent that there is any utility investment considered, you really have to have a rigorous cost-benefit analysis on, are the benefits going to exceed the costs? But there's a couple things that I think that are important notes to that. One is, Phil mentioned this earlier, the availability of data. We don't have as much data as we should have. I know that many states now have AMI, smart meters. That opens up a lot of opportunities to find proactive ways to make sure that researchers from all sectors have access to that, so they can run analyses to see the types of effects that certain policy changes would have. So making sure that we can get access to data, I think, is crucial. And I don't think that we've done, as an industry, all that well through the years in making that kind of data available. And I think that's key. We're obviously talking a lot about new things, and there's going to be pilots. And pilots are always a little bit difficult because you don't know, you don't know what the outcome's going to be, and you don't have the data yet. The one thing we would suggest is that, and advocate for, is that any pilot have essentially strict metrics on what is being tested. Essentially, what would success be? What would failure be? What can we learn? Have an examination of that. And also always be sort of cognizant of what's the path to scale. I think we don't want to have pilots just for pilot's sake. We want to have a pilot because we can learn and then say, aha, how can we build on that? A corollary to that is there's a lot of stuff going on across the country, and to the extent it's possible, if we can have pilots that kind of test different sort of things, so we're not all doing the exact same thing, I think that that's something to at least keep in mind, recognizing, of course, that there are significant differences between states. It doesn't mean that you can do that perfectly. Equitable treatment, I think, is key. The worldview that we espouse, in a sense, what we're saying is that if you do the grid maximization right, that everyone's going to benefit. That includes lower income folks, but that's not the only question. I think it's important that lower income communities have access to EV programs to the extent that utilities consumer dollars are paying for it. That's my own view. I think the rental market is interesting. I do tend to think at the end of the day it's probably ride sharing. We have seen some interesting opportunities there, public transit, but we do want to make sure that the equity issue is confronted honestly and we find solutions that are fair for all customers. I think that's very important. And then lastly, consumer education and protection. I don't know exactly who should be doing that. I think that this does bring in, obviously, as was mentioned earlier, this is a broader state interest. But at the end of the day, I do think information on what pricing options are there, if the utility is involved, why is the utility involved? And especially in the beginning, we would expect lots of different kinds of offers, lots of different ways to pay for it. And I think someone needs to provide, there needs to be education for consumers to make sure that they're choosing, that they know what they're choosing, that the markets work best when people have good information, and that function shouldn't be overlooked. So with that, for more information, you can see our report. We have hard copies, but you can get it on our website. And then I also gave you the web address for the evaccord.com, which I think is a good set of principles that can help frame this discussion. So thank you, and look forward to the questions.
Dave, thank you very much. I think let's go in reverse order than what we went last time. So, Christina, if you have questions, would you like to start? No? Howard, questions?
Just sort of a general one. Earlier today, I think Phil gave us one of the rate designs that was used to attack this problem of how to shift the loads away from creating a new peak or exacerbating the existing peak. I think it was Phil said that in Oregon that they had looked at, and it was you've got a holiday where they postponed some of the charges or the penalties. What I'd like to do to open this up for everybody is, are there other examples that you can think of states that have looked at this and what kind of, or utilities have looked at it, what kind of rate designs have you seen?
So this is Tom. I'll just give a quick start. So I'm sorry, I'm going to point to California. So San Diego Gas and Electric has what it's basically a time variant rate, but they call it the vehicle grid integration rate. And it's specifically designed to account for a lot of different factors on the system. And so the pricing signals that it offers, it's on a hourly day-ahead basis, but it incorporates circuit conditions. It incorporates prices of generation and a lot of other components. And so it's a price-based mechanism which thus far seems to be encouraging drivers to the right charging behavior. But they are still on the front end of deploying this program.
Yeah, let me go back. So it's done on a day ahead basis?
Day ahead hourly, yes.
Day ahead hourly, okay, thank you.
I believe, sorry.
Okay.
I was going to say, I believe what you're referring to from Phil Jones's earlier comments was a DC fast charging demand charge alternate rate tariff, where it would be a volumetric, a higher volumetric rate as opposed to the demand charge, which is more difficult if you have low volume of charging at a particular site, because the demand charge cannot be amortized across many different vehicle drivers. HECO has adopted something similar. Hawaiian Electric Company in Honolulu has adopted something similar with the volumetric rate. Demand charges are certainly a challenge. And in the report I referenced earlier, we actually have illustrated 10 different scenarios of how it could be addressed through a variety of rate structure changes as well as technology changes.
Just offhand, do you recall how they came about, either in Hawaii or your other example, how they came up with a single kilowatt hour rate? You know what they looked at to come up with it?
That I don't have the details, but I could certainly look into that for you.
If you wouldn't mind, it would be helpful to see. I mean, obviously it'll be different here because we'll have different cost components, but if they had some type of algorithm that they looked at in coming up with that rate or adjusted, periodically, that would be helpful.
Certainly.
So I was going to mention, this is Mike Waters with ChargePoint. Two top of mind things when it comes to potential opportunities with rates, one being the DC fast charging, and we've seen some variations of that in Maryland. The proposals included a credit basically for a period of time off of what could be the maximum demand that would be on the bill. So that provides a little bit of runway, right, for the number of EVs out there and the utilization of those stations to increase to the point where those demand charges might be more manageable. SCE in California did also propose the volumetric approach for, let's say, 5 years. So obviously they're raising the volumetric, eliminating the demand charge, but then in that second half, they're trying to get it back to where it was, right? So they'll use that second half to try to get back to the traditional demand versus volume. The other thing I would say, and it may not have been what you were thinking of, but I would also say at the home, right? I think one of the interesting things could be a virtual TOU rate using embedded metering within the charging station. So as was mentioned earlier, whole house TOU rates can work if people are willing to move their whole house. But if we could have a way to actually track and incentivize charging off peak through the charging station, the metering within that, that could open up a whole new paradigm for people to be able to charge off peak and be directly incentivized for that device within the home. And I know Minnesota is doing some really great work looking at that without having to go through a second utility meter and a separate circuit that would normally be used in the past, right?
Just to add on that, Minnesota is evaluating an opportunity using AMI to separately meter the vehicle charging. They're doing that as a part of a 100 household test case.
This is Joe Halso with Sierra Club. I'll pile on only to bring the conversation out of the purely light-duty vehicle realm and into medium and heavy duty, and just note that in Southern California, Edison's territory took a similar approach of sort of a demand charge holiday for a period of years to support transportation electrification for transit buses that were owned by government fleets and are now moving to a time of use based rate in order to limit the impacts of demand charges and encourage that technology adoption in that specific context.
I mean, the DC fast charging issue is probably the most complicated issue that's out there right now from a consumer point of view. We're actually doing some analysis and modeling on it. I will say in general, my sense is that the easiest way to handle a lot of this would just simply be real-time pricing, and we're in and those price signals being sent. And people can respond to those, or entities can reprice if they want, but they're paying it. I understand that there are other options as well, and you may want to go with TOU or critical peak pricing. But at the end of the day, we need price signals to help coordinate this, and there are a variety of options. But certainly there has to be some program. And a lot of the pilots we've seen, California is testing sort of 3 different approaches, and we'll see what comes out of that. You know, I think more work needs to be done to figure out exactly what the right combination is, and it might vary by state.
Yeah, isn't it okay, because you indicated real-time pricing, and I think Mike was talking about day-ahead pricing.
Yeah.
Is there a significant difference? Are there pros
So I'm
and
actually on,
cons?
Illinois has residential opt-in real-time pricing. I think we're the only one, and we have about 40,000 people on it. The way it works is you get the day ahead, but your charge, ComEd, our utility in the north, charges the actual real-time. Ameren, our utility in the south, just simply charges the day ahead. They don't actually vary all that much, but they do a little bit, and depending on your perspective, whether you might want to make the perfect the enemy, the good enough. My view, to be honest, is we should just stick with the day ahead. That there isn't enough variability at this point to make the added accuracy worth it. Having said that, when and if everything is automated and everything is just simply prices to devices of some sort, well then you might as well just go with the realest of the real.
Well, thank you all very much.
Erika, excuse me, going back to the last point you mentioned, I thought what you said, and explain it if you would, that there's some trial that's using smart meters to separately meter EV charging, I assume at the home, or is it?
That's correct.
That's correct. How does that mean it?
It's through disaggregating the load.
How does it do that? It kind of figures it out.
I am not the AMI expert in the room. I know Oracle's here. But I'm looking for data on that as well.
And do you know, do the AEP smart meters, do they have that capability?
I would not know.
I would.
Well, ask Scott Osterholt. Okay.
We're a little bit familiar with this because we do have AMI in Illinois, and we do have an anonymous data access tariff there. So we've been able to get access to anonymized data, but on a pretty low level. And we know, so EVs have essentially a signature, right? And if you know, and the utility can know, like people who opt in, to let them know that they have an EV. So I think from a data point of view, you can figure out what's a utility and what's not pretty easily for these types of programs, and so you wouldn't need a separate meter, and that you could disaggregate. The policy question comes, what's billing quality data and what's not, and that will be an issue that you have to work through, because the rules for billing quality data that most utilities that I'm aware of are pose attention to just simply using the kind of AMI data with a signature and saying, okay, this is what the EV was.
And then also, Erika, your slide that provided the information about projections for, that they're the EEI projections for the EV chargers are going to be deployed by 2025, the 4.4 million to 5.5 million. Mm-hmm. Do you know how does that break down between level 1, level 2 on the one hand, and DC fast charging on the other hand? Is that what the top little?
Yeah, so the DC fast charging would be within the public red line, or in this case, the light blue. And it does not break down what percentage of that would be DC fast versus level 2 in the public sphere. And these are both based on NREL and EPRI models, so I'm sure it would be possible to use that information to derive what the percentage would be for each.
The reason I ask, Erika, is that my reaction to your reference to it earlier, my reaction was, I wonder, my reaction was, I thought, well, it makes sense that A lot of these meters are these chargers, excuse me, are going to be deployed just organically by the customers as they adopt. And they may not need much encouragement or incentive by us. And maybe that's not quite accurate, but maybe it is. Hope it is accurate. So if it is accurate, then is the problem of meeting this large target, it's maybe not that much of a problem. It's just going to happen on its own. Is that not right?
Well, so if you were to look at the availability of chargers, you can buy a charger on Amazon, but it is not a smart charger. It is not connected to the internet, and most likely the individual using it just wants the basic capabilities. If a utility wanted to aggregate these chargers, it would be unable to do so with the dumb charger. So the additional incremental cost between a non-Wi-Fi capable or a Wi-Fi capable charger would potentially be something that could be assisted by the utility to enable those managed charging capabilities.
So what you're suggesting, I think, then, is that we might have a role in influencing adoption of a better charging device than might otherwise be adopted.
That is correct.
Okay. And then finally, Joe, do you know who won the Big Ten men's basketball tournament this weekend?
I do, Commissioner. Do you want me to report that?
Please.
The University of Michigan Wolverines.
And how often has that happened recently?
That's happened for the second straight year, and I believe no other team has achieved that result.
Hey, Joe, could you also tell us what the University of Michigan football team record is against the Ohio State Buckeyes over the past 15 years? That would also be a helpful data point as well for this discussion.
Chairman Hawk, I want to report complete data here, and I'll note that it is the winningest program of all time.
Well played. Okay, Dan, are you good?
I think that completes my line of questions.
Okay. Commissioner Friedman.
I'd like to follow up on Commissioner Conway's questions, not about Michigan, Dan, I'm sorry, not about Michigan. Mike or Tom, forgive me, I can't remember which one of you referenced the 80 to 85% of EVs are charged within the residence. Is that correct?
Generally speaking, 80% of all charging is done at the home, right? But obviously not everybody has their own garage, but that's just saying on average, yeah.
Yeah, and Tom, I think you had mentioned a portfolio as opposed to the walk, jog, and run approach in the slide presentation. I'm going to make a statement. There'll be a question embedded, so you're going to have to pay attention to this, okay? There'll be a test at the end. If we remain mindful of the cost implications associated with the activities and what we choose to do, do you, and this is not the question, Mike, would you anticipate there being a material change in behavior if there were critical infrastructure implemented relative to fast charging station, public fast charging stations, in terms of the charging behavior of individuals? Would they still charge 80 to 85% of the time at home?
So is that the question now?
No, it's not the question. It's a preliminary question.
Right.
It's not a rhetorical
No,
question.
I think what will be interesting is with the innovation of new technology and the new power levels out there, including DC fast charging, as we see more of those put out there along corridors, and we see the evolution up into from 50 kilowatts a day now, potentially over 250, 300 kilowatts. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that does affect what would be the day in the life, right, of an EV driver. I think, though, what we'll always see is that home charging at the end of the day will likely be the majority because it's just the convenience factor. It's the price, right? It's in your home.
Right.
I just really think that'll probably always be the case. And then the question will be, what's the right mix of what would be AC level 2 versus DC fast charging out in the public sphere, right? I think, again, there'll always be a place for all that, because even as vehicles have, you might have a 300-mile range vehicle, you're still going to have ones that are 100 miles. You're still going to have some that are plug-in hybrids that might have 20 or 40 miles. So I think you still need charging at work. You still need charging at destination places around town. But the DC fast charging will fill its niche, right, in terms of helping people who may not have a home to charge at, or just are going between cities, because we need to open that up too, right? A lot of the vehicles to date have only been really useful around metro areas. You really didn't take it to go, to different states. It would have been a big hassle, right? So as we see these longer range vehicles, we do need the DC fast charging to fill in those gaps.
And while I recognize, Erika, that there may be different sophistication levels associated with the residential charging, I guess the ultimate question for all of you would be, is there a method to the madness of allowing the market to evolve as the opportunities present themselves, rather than jump-starting a market through the introduction of critical public charging infrastructure, in the sense that if the investment is made primarily in residential home charging, will that materially impede the evolution of a broader EV market relative to public charging stations?
If I may,
Yeah, please, that's why I asked.
the answer from our perspective is yes.
I figured.
So, I mean, just without going too deep, I mean, the fact of the matter is the majority of charging is happening at home, and it's happening in single-family homes, and it's happening in communities potentially of a certain socioeconomic makeup. And, going forward, if we think about the home as single-family home, that's one thing. If we think about the home as multi-unit dwelling or multifamily home, that's a different thing. And as we heard, from Joe in particular earlier, that multi-unit home, which increasingly is more of where America is calling home, is not an area that is going to develop on its own adequately. But what I would also urge consideration of is that, our relationship with mobility is evolving. And, whether it's we don't have access to a dedicated parking space because we live in a multi-unit dwelling, or maybe we don't want to own a car because we don't need to, because there's a transit system, there are transportation network companies. There is a time, and if we go to the very brave future where things may be more or even exclusively autonomous, there will still be a mix of those vehicles that may live at home, but we're going to see more and more in the public space.
Okay, thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Just to kind of follow up on that, I mean, and I've been thinking about the, having these charging stations, and as far as the customer paying for the energy they use, I mean, do you have a position on that? I mean, say my gosh, we've got a charging station, and we can pull in and we can go all the way to Chicago because of it. I mean, do you have a position on who pays for that energy?
So I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think for the most part, when we look at our independent owner-operators of our stations, right, they are the utility customers, so they're already, they're paying that energy, and then they in turn have that decision to make in terms of how they want to recover not only their costs, but looking at it from a bigger perspective of it's a service more than a commodity, because it's really part of the parking solution there and whatever else is going on. So it's not necessarily them just saying, hey, I need to pass through 10 cents a kilowatt hour, but maybe it's something, different where it's $1 an hour, or maybe it's, $2 after a period of time, right, to encourage people to move on. So it's just broader in our mind than just a kilowatt hour charge. It's just more around what does that site host want to do in terms of incentivizing the right usage of their station, but also recovering what's reasonable, right, from their cost perspective.
I mean, I'm a person who pays for air at a gas station. I mean, they want me to pay for air. But what I mean is, I think it's a little bit unreasonable to think that we're going to have somebody else pay for the energy. But I can see where, you know, a store or somebody who wants to provide good relations, and they might do that. I'm not crossing that out, but I'm just saying from a expectation standpoint, I think that's, you know, and I'm kind of off topic maybe a little bit.
No, I mean, we've actually spent a fair amount of time thinking through the same thing because because I mean, at the end of the day, I think the way we've reconciled all of this is that we want to make sure someone is paying the real cost, someone is paying the real price signal. In the example of say a Target that decides, well, for whatever other business reason, I think we're okay with that. At scale, we need to start thinking through some of the implications of that, and there are maybe some weird education that would be delivered if people start, you know, the free weekends and nights for electricity maybe doesn't send the right systemic message. But I think at the end of the day, we want to allow for different types of pricing as long as someone is paying the real costs, and if they choose to repackage it, I think that's okay. But it's an interesting area to consider.
I think maybe at the beginning there's you know, different things could happen to encourage it and all this. But I mean, as far as expectations are concerned, I mean, I worry about that, and I also think that the legislature ought to be involved, and probably at an earlier, you know, as hard as these problems seem to be, you know, if we get a huge amount of people that have these vehicles, and you know, it might be harder to deal with then than it is now.
So.
The other thing I wanted to say, and this is even more off topic, but very important to, you know, we're part of government, is how are these roads going to be paid for? And, you know, well, yeah, they're now paid with gas tax. And I imagine an argument could be made, well, you just keep upping the gas tax and encourage people to go to the electric vehicles, but that really doesn't you know, it really doesn't solve things in the, and you don't really need to answer that question unless you want to. But, you know, if you are approaching the legislature, you know, you might need other solutions also.
Yeah, I would mention too that, I mean, that is a good question. It's being brought up in a lot of places. And it's actually the regular gasoline cars that are driving that, right, because of the CAFE standard. So there's already a whole lot less gasoline being sold, right? It's not necessarily EVs alone which are causing that issue, but it's a good question. We've seen discussions around vehicle miles traveled, et cetera. But probably a different day, different topic on that. But and just to close on your last comment too on the pricing, we do agree that I think free is never, it's usually not a good thing, right? You get bad behavior sometimes. So we do encourage our site hosts to consider putting some type of fee, and we give them a bunch of different ways to do it. But at the end of the day, you know, we let them figure that out, what works for them.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to Tom's question. Is there anything on the horizon now that you know, a different type of filling mechanism that's either used here or overseas that may come in and change the economics of that we've been talking about in terms of fast charge or even slow charge?
I'll take a first crack at that. I mean, the one thing would be the DC fast charging. I alluded to that earlier. We're seeing a new generation of vehicles that can accept a much higher rate of charge. So that means the charging dispensers out there are going to be capable of up to 400, even 500 kilowatts. I think that's still ways out there, and we're not going to see vehicles out there on the road tomorrow that can do that. I think we'll also see a lot more of the heavier duty, you know, buses, et cetera, that'll be utilizing the higher rates of charge. And then wireless charging is out there, but, you know, again, I think what's probably going to drive that more is autonomous, right, and car sharing transition that we're seeing out there today in the transportation sector. And when that comes about, we might see a little bit more on the wireless side.
Tom, you talked about enabling legislation in a number of states, and you mentioned at least one state included rebates. What other type of things did this enabling legislation include, and how did they partner with their commissions? Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, so Washington may be the sole example of maybe an adequate partnership or communication with the commission in advance of going forward with enabling legislation, with the possible exception that California has a lot going on, of course. By and large, EV specific enabling legislation, it's about the utility can or should or will do something. So the Nevada legislation, for instance, it was part of a package that, the EV charging rebate part of it was the smaller part of the package. The larger part of it was storage incentives that, again, had a utility role to facilitate and provide those. We're seeing, different approaches taken. By and large, it's utility, you can do something, or utility, you should do something. There are a lot of other pieces out there that have overlap. You saw a number of slides today with all these overlapping things, and whether that is addressing lower income or disadvantaged communities. So that's been part of the flavor in California, pretty significant part of it. Or going forward, we may see some that are more transit specific or port or freight specific. So I wouldn't say there's one approach that is the approach. For instance, the Washington enabling policy, it was primarily focused on long dwell time locations. So it left open the question of how to approach DC fast charging.
Okay. Anyone else on that?
Sure, I'll add on a little bit here. What Tom mentioned, some have been about whether utilities ought to take action and whether or not they can. And so just to put a finer point on it, in Massachusetts, for instance, legislation authorizes a utility role and defines the standard by which the Department of Public Utilities would judge a proposed utility program, but doesn't require action by the state's utilities. California and Oregon, by comparison, they not only authorize utility action, but require the utilities to propose programs and proposals to meet certain air quality and climate goals. And then sort of a third category or flavor we've seen in Nevada and Utah are sort of one-off authorizations. In Nevada, for instance, authorizing access to a pot of money for solar, wind, storage incentives that is shrinking and will be shared among those competing interests. In Utah, for instance, authorizing a straight-up $10 million investment over a period of 5 years. And Sierra Club's view has been that those one-off authorizations are less helpful and ought to be discouraged in favor of authorization that clears up what the legal and policy approach from commissions ought to be.
Thank you.
Okay, let me, this has been a really educational couple of panels, and this is for this panel, and I still see Phil in the crowd, and I see Catherine in the crowd, and Sam's still in the crowd, and so I just kind of want to walk through what I think may be sort of like a mental step-by-step rubric for what could eventually be commission papered activity here, okay? So from a policy perspective, I think it's pretty easy for the agency to say we would love to see electric vehicle charging stations get deployed across the state. I mean, I think that's a pretty easy policy statement to make, no strings attached policy statement to make. Where things get really hairy is sort of the prioritization or the mapping of deployment areas. That's where things get really, really challenging. And Tom's mentioned the legislature. I think that piece of the puzzle is, I think, challenging for the economic regulator, the PUCO, to make a decision on where EV charging stations should be deployed across the state. But okay, let me keep going there. I think that's a really challenging piece. But let me keep going there. Let us say that a decision is made, however, that as backbone electric vehicle infrastructure, we need to get EV charging stations deployed. We won't talk about how that decision gets made. Again, that's a challenging piece. But let's say that someone makes that determination that there is a backbone level of EV infrastructure that needs to get deployed. Well, then the commission could say, we think that, and there is a slide in many slide decks that basically say traditional utility role, a little bit more turnkey. Okay, it's in 4 or 5 decks that we've seen here. The commission could then say, we think that the utility can go beyond its traditional utility role in order to get this sort of backbone infrastructure deployed. Okay, so I guess I'm just looking for affirmation as I tick off these steps. I mean, anything crazy so far? Ever said anything? No? Okay. So then the commission could also say, here's what sort of the rate-making, rate design elements will look like. The commission could also say, distribution utilities, you have to make sure as these EV charging stations are proliferated that you are maintaining the distribution system appropriately, maybe part of the whole distribution planning discussion as well that we had yesterday. Then from there, the commission could say, utilities, if you are essentially in charge of some of these EV stations, you should be taking opportunities to bid potential benefits into wholesale markets. Then the commission could say, we also believe that those benefits should be socialized across whatever socialization we decide to have it spread across. And the commission, of course, could establish a working group that is continuously monitoring the industry, is continuously monitoring what's going on here, because this is clearly something that is going to evolve, and we'll have to continue to monitor what the evolution looks like. Okay, done. All right. Commentary on that. I mean, is this all sensible? Am I missing something? Talk to me. Seeing nodding heads from Phil Jones. Catherine, go ahead.
I guess I would just say that I've heard a lot of comments here about the VGI, various parts of VGI, and the managed charging element. But as Phil pointed out, one of your initial comments, Ohio only has 8,000 EVs on the road.
Hey, actually, will you do me a favor? Will you please come to the mic? I'm sorry. Because we are televising to millions and millions of viewers. And so I did not want to deprive those millions of viewers.
Or the 8,000 who actually are involved in this.
So Catherine Stankin with Plug in America for those viewers at home. I guess I'm just, the part that I loved everything that you were saying right there, I think it sounds fantastic. I think when you're talking about, you mentioned earlier in one of your comments about making the EV package to the consumer kind of most attractive as possible, and looking at, you mentioned just now, using EVs to sell into the wholesale market. I think that I'm just concerned that you might get wrapped up in that, and that's a conversation that could take a long time to help to really develop. And as Phil was saying initially, you only have 8,000 EVs on the road right now. So what benefit can you really get from those 8,000 EVs right now? I think it's more important to focus on the infrastructure build out as a first step, besides and let that move forward quickly now, as as Britta's slides were showing this morning, how fast the growth is going to occur.
Yeah.
To focus on that first, and then in a second step, or as your working group is developing more thoughts on managed charging, then incorporate that in.
So then that's something that you could express an intent for, a desire for, and then as it continues to progress, you could say.
So if I could comment on that, because I'm sensitive to what you're saying. On the other hand, I do think it's important to be working on that issue from the get-go. And you're right, fundamentally, with only 8,000 cars on the road, the amount of revenue you're going to be able to get is not that great. But it's very important to make sure as that scales that we know exactly the best way to do it. And we set up that as a precedent, as an expectation. And I've seen too many times, if you look back in the history of demand response, where people made there were similar kind of arguments. We don't have to worry about it now. And then it becomes very difficult to reverse engineer it. So I'm sensitive to it. We both signed the Transportation Electrification Accord, and we basically agree. But I do think it's important to keep working on that and having that be part of the design from the get-go, even if other things are prioritized.
Yeah, I guess I'm not saying don't work on it at all, just,
Yeah.
yeah, we're saying the same thing. Start looking at it now, but don't let that decision hold up other easy decisions that you can make in terms of the charging infrastructure.
Got it. Phil?
Just I'll be quick and practical here. I like your summing up, just a couple of adds to consider. One is keep this docket open if you can, or find some way, maybe this is the working group, but keep a generic docket open because as you say, technology is changing. I think you asked about charging infrastructure. This technology and business models are changing constantly. Second, allow utilities to file, even if you have an ongoing docket. I think you should not impede utilities from filing for rate recovery or specific pilots, encourage pilots. And the last thing is maybe OPSI. If we get into this aggregating up to PJM, I know Commissioner Trumbull, you're active on OPSI and many of you are, but maybe look to work with your fellow states within a more regional structure about how to grapple with some of these issues, because these EVs are not going to stop at your border with Indiana or Ontario. You know, these cars travel.
Very good.
Yeah, I would just say too, I agree with the framework. Obviously, that's there's going to be a lot more detail involved in that in terms of additional meetings, and that's where the devil's in the details, right? And that's where we can really help figure out how these things work in practicality, right? What are the guidelines? What are the use cases that are going to benefit the most from additional utility involvement? And also just thinking about, again, what are those guidelines that help ensure that the utilities are able to work alongside, right, with the private marketplace and vice versa, right? How do we learn from them in terms of what's necessary so that they can help get data and be able to manage this load from a holistic standpoint too, not just from necessarily stations in a narrow pilot or something like that. We want to provide the most value we can from all the stations that are deployed out there today. So just thinking of it from that standpoint.
And can I ask you a specific question? I don't know. Before today, I didn't know the players in the EV marketplace really. Now, I expected you to come and say, don't let the utilities have a role in ownership in these charging stations. But that's not your position.
No, not at all. We welcome utility involvement, and it needs to happen.
I mean,
I think
involvement, maybe that is to.
and there's multiple ways to do that.
It needs to be a more focused term.
Right.
So ownership.
Yeah, ownership's definitely one of the models. As I mentioned earlier, SDG&E, PG&E, and others have proposed ownership models. It's not a if or or yes or no on the ownership. That's not. I think that misses the point of how does it actually get deployed in a way that also keeps that site host involved in this process, right? Keeps them engaged in this. And so do they still have the ability to select their vendor, right, that they would want out of a qualified list? And that's what SDG&E and PG&E have done. So it's not utility ownership. It's the question over how does it work in concert with the site host today and what they're able to choose and how they're able to help optimize utilization of the station through managing that driver experience. So that's what's more important, I think, from our standpoint.
And to me, it brings us back to the chicken or the egg problem that a few of you folks have identified. Other thoughts from Joe? You look like you want to say something.
I do, yeah.
You're not allowed. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead.
You identified a challenge as where the stations will go. And so I just like to note that I think, in terms of market segments where the stations will go, we can take a look around the state and knowing where people tend to charge and where charging is needed and what's missing, that information and direction, I think, can result from sort of the brain trust in this room and does not need to come from a policy directive from elsewhere. In terms of actual specific address locations for charging, I'd hope that as it is in the private market, that in the context of a utility program, that would be market-driven based on interest of potential site hosts who would presumably have the equipment on their property, whether or not the utility owns the box and plug of the charging station or owns the underlying infrastructure or simply provides a rebate.
So tell me again, where's the brain trust in the room here? What are we doing in that? I thought I was going to challenge you and say I think what you said second was correct, that we don't want to. We want to let the market do this locational decision making primarily, but what was the first part?
The first point is about those segments that need to be served, and so when I refer to segments, I mean home charging, which can then be subdivided into a multi-unit dwelling versus single-family home, workplace as another segment, and then DC fast charging, which is a technology, but I think you'd categorize as a segment. Corridor charging, that charging that enables intercity travel, cross-state travel, and sort of unlocks the benefits of an EV that make it more attractive as a purchase for somebody. It might not enable EV adoption the way getting a charging station into a home or a multi-unit dwelling where it didn't otherwise exist would, but increases that likelihood of EV adoption for someone looking at their vehicle purchase options. And those decisions, I think, can be made just taking a look at the state where infrastructure is and isn't. Can you get from Columbus to Cleveland using fast charging stations, et cetera?
Thanks. And Mike, as did Chairman Hawk, I expected you to come in here and be pushing back on the idea of utility involvement and particularly utility ownership of the fast charging and other charging stations. And then I saw your chart, your bar chart, which had the different types of involvement kind of mapped out, and I thought you were going to say that you preferred the one which involved the rebates that would be your preference, but that's not the case either. You think?
I think each one of those has their own pros and cons, right? I mean, for a make-ready approach, in ownership, you deal with easements and some other burdens there. With rebates, I think that probably is the most efficient way. If a utility is able to capture the main benefit of receiving data and be able to do demand response, while at the same time, minimizing the easement issues and the ownership issues, I think that can be the most efficient to deploy. But, again, it's specific to the jurisdiction, specific to the use cases, like on the ownership. I mean, I think ownership and handling all of those costs of the whole system might make more sense with a local government or in a disadvantaged community where the needs are greater. If you're in a workplace environment, they're already putting in a lot of stations today, and they're willing to put a lot of capital in. So that may not be the best, type of model in that situation. So yeah, I mean, I think that each one has their own advantages and disadvantages. But they all could work. It's just all, again, and how they're designed.
Clear?
Yeah, just a quick question, I guess clarification. You said that utility ownership is one model. Do you see that as a jumpstart approach to market development or a long-term approach to the market?
So I think when I say utility ownership too, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that you've got ownership and then you've got the ability to kind of have a say in how that station's operated, and you can separate them, right, with the technology that we're talking about today, where site hosts can still play a role, see the data, run reports, and potentially set pricing. So that's why I kind of set aside ownership in and of itself does not necessarily answer the question of who gets to have a say in how it's operated. To your other question around, I think whether it's ownership or rebates or make-ready, all three of those can help accelerate the market. I mean, the market's in a good position now, but it could be better. Just like electric vehicles, right? We'd like to see more electric vehicles on the road. We need new models, so we'd love to see more charging infrastructure out there to support that. So I think there's easily an argument to be made that any of those can help accelerate the market. Our advice would be, how do we do so in a way that maintains market forces still helping to play a role, right? In other words, helping to guide decisions, and because at the end of the day, do we want the market to be reliant? Whether it be a government grant or utilities owning the stations, I think we want to encourage the market to keep taking a greater and greater role in this space. And so if you design the program right, I think down the road you're going to see more of that be taking care of itself, right, from the private market.
Good? You good?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
We're getting it all out.
One last general question. It's, now sort of thinking how to funnel all this down into a report. Everyone indicated when we started making this last round of answers that, Ohio only has 8,000 electric vehicles, and that raises the question, why? Because if we're going to raise the number, the first thing we'd say is, what's the current barrier? Let's remove that. And I would be curious, why do you think we only have 8,000 here? What do you think the major barrier is today? What's the biggest barrier we ought to remove if we want to see the number of electric vehicles increase?
So if I may,
Yeah, please.
I mean, we heard earlier from the other panel, the the barrier for folks who know about EVs and are interested in EVs fundamentally is lack of reliable infrastructure or lack of adequate infrastructure. But we also acknowledge that the larger challenge, but one that is maybe less addressable, and certainly maybe less addressable by the stakeholders in this room, is the level of education and awareness that drivers or vehicle owners have about this technology, the vehicle offerings available, et cetera. So that's the whole swath of people who don't know about EVs and don't even know that infrastructure is a barrier because they don't know enough about the technology in the first place.
Just to give my 2 cents on it, I mean, I think that up to this point it's sort of been cost and availability, but that's getting better and better and better. It's our perception that there is a big problem with dealers, given their incentives, and they don't make as much money off of electric vehicles. So, I mean, that's not necessarily anything that we can do, sort of a broader public policy question, but certainly we've noticed where in Illinois that there's not as many dealers selling them as you might expect, and our understanding of that is incentives.
We're going to regulate them too. I'm just kidding. Christine, did you have a question? I'm sorry. No. Anybody else? Joe? You're good?
I'll have a friendly argument with Tom about whether or not utilities can be natural, trusted messengers for education outreach. Certainly in the context of an infrastructure program, that should be there, and Dave mentioned this point earlier. And also just as a general matter, advising their ratepayers of what rates may be available that would support electric vehicles at the home and support that grid integration, I think, is a natural role for the utilities, and the commission should recognize that.
Very good.
If I may, Chairman.
Yes, please.
I do not disagree with Joe on this matter. I indeed believe that utilities are extremely well positioned to play a key role in helping educate and conduct outreach. It was acknowledged by GM earlier. They would love to have, the information list, the ability to reach the level of potential customers that the utility has in their back pocket. What I wanted to acknowledge is that there's a limit to how far that goes. Even if we maximize it, there are still other players who maybe are not at the table or in the room that need to have an important role as well. As Dave acknowledged, dealers are one.
Very good. Give our panelists a big round of applause. Okay, we are way behind, and it's my fault. But let us take 5 minutes and come back. 5 minutes. Thanks.